Server components let us fetch data without having to create an additional endpoint. Now, typically, you would create an additional API endpoint, create a client component, and get that client component to invoke the API endpoint to get data. But this will essentially lead to a unnecessary network round trip, and which is why server actions are here to save us. Server actions lets us mutate data without creating an additional endpoint, and it can also provide the new UI in one network round trip. In this specific video, we will build an application together that will walk through server actions in depth, including revalidatePath, redirect, and more. We will be using a library called as Zod to perform runtime TypeScript validations, and we will be storing data in a PostGres database. There is more that we will cover in this specific video, so let's get started. So first, let's walk you through a demo of what we are going to build. So this is a very simple application with a header and a form. This specific form has one input field where you can enter your dog's name. Now, this specific input field also has some validations, and we have designed this entire application using Tailwind CSS. Now, let's say I hit submit without entering a dog's name like it's asking us. Then let's see what happens. All right, so you can see that there's a validation message here that says string must contain at least one character. And there's also a database error saying missing fields failed to create user. So it has a form validation message, which is an error, as well as a database error as well displayed right here. So now let's enter Luna Bean as a dog's name and hit enter. The minute we do that, you can see that Luna Bean is actually available on the post page, which is the exact information that we entered in our form. Now, this specific page is pulling information from our Postgres database, and whenever we hit submit in the form, that also inserts data into our database, which is our users table right now. So if we head over to our Vercel dashboard, this is where we are configuring the Postgres database. So if you're interested in configuring Postgres, then you can go ahead on vercel.com and sign up and then head over to storage to connect your project with a Postgres database. Now, we won't be going through the setup for that, but it's pretty straightforward. Now you will see all the credentials here. But what I really love about this specific extension and just the general config with Vercel is that in the getting started section, it tells you exactly what to do step by step. So first we connect a project, then we pull our latest environment variables, and keep this in mind, all of this is done using Vercel CLI tool. So you first need to use Vercel link to connect the project, then pull the latest environment variables, again using the Vercel CLI tool, install the package, and then execute the code. Now, let's say we have done all of that. We can head over to data, and here we can also query our database as well. So when I click on users, you can see that Luna Bean was the latest entry that we inserted into the database through our form. And we can query this database as well. By going to the query tab, you can run any SQL commands over here as well. So I can just say select or delete from users, and that will delete all the users from the database as well. So now if I go to users, you will see that there are no rows returned for this specific query. We will be using Postgres database to insert data as well as query data, but at the same time, we will be doing all of this using server actions. So let's get started. So now let's take a look at the code for how we would do things before server actions. So now this is a very simple diagram to illustrate what we are trying to say. So before server actions, we would have a client component with a use client directive. And a client component is a component that will render things in the browser and not on the server. So for example, this specific client component will have a form that will have a handle submit handler. In this handle submit handler, we are invoking the API request using fetch. And as we do that, this specific API route needs to also be created. And this specific API route will then execute some sort of an SQL code. It will insert things into the database. It will create a user for us. And for that, it will go ahead and call the Postgres database for us and then get data back, which will then give it back to our client component. And then depending on how we want to handle the response from the server, then we would go ahead and handle the routing logic. We would route the user to a different page if the user has been creating, and so on, depending on the criteria of your application. But now, after server actions, we don't need to create an API route at all. We can just skip this part, and this itself could be turned into a server action, which is essentially a function that we can create with a use server directive, and then you can execute all your server code, that is SQL code, inside of that. Plus, it has the magical powers of routing as well. So that's the benefit of using server actions in general. So let's take a look at the code first before server actions. So before server action, we would have a submit handler, which gets invoked from the form. And then we parse the data from the form. And then we invoke a specific API request using fetch. And then depending on the response we get, we can decide to route. So here the router code would go. But over here, we have an API folder with create user route, which is essentially a post request that will extract the messages from the body or whatever code necessary, invoke the SQL code, call the PostGres database, and then convert it into a response that we can parse. Now, this is exactly how things would work before server action. So now let's take a look at how we will build this specific functionality using server actions. So now let's go ahead and create our first server action. So now we have this very straightforward form that we have seen before. So we have an input field for dog's name and a submit button, and we are wrapping it all up with a form because this is a form. Now, in order for us to create a first server action, we need to use a property called as action and then call whatever name we like. I definitely like to add the name action and prepend it to the name, just so that it's really obvious that it's not a regular function, it's in fact a server action, and you will really appreciate it as your application scales as well. Now, if we just say create user action, because that's what we're going to do, we're going to create the user as we hit submit. So now, here we need to create a function called as create user action, which needs to be an async function. And here it takes in form data, which is form data. Now, what we need to do is here we need to retrieve the value from form data. In order for us to make sure that this specific function is a server action, you need to call use server directive over here, which makes it a server action. So this will be executed as a server action. Now, in order for us to get name, we can just say form data dot get and name. And the reason is because we have name equals name here, and that's how we're getting it. So now let's just try to log it and log name just to make sure everything works okay. And for that reason, let's go ahead and add Kobe. Now let's go ahead and enter the name Kobe, and let's just hit submit. Now if we go to the terminal, you will see that Kobe name is in fact printed, which is awesome because our first server action is executed. And now if we expand the screen here and go to inspect and hit the network tab, and let's move this network tab to the right. And now if we were to do this thing again, let's just say Kobe again and hit submit. If we filter by fetch, you will notice that it is in fact a post request, and it says 200 okay with payload being named Kobe. So this request is in fact being sent as a server action, which is awesome. So our first server action is ready to go. So now that we have this name, let's get it set up with our database. So we will be using PostGres database. And if we head over to Vercel, we already have done a walkthrough and know exactly how to connect a database here. Now here we have our tables users, and we want to make sure that whenever anytime we enter name in the form, then it gets inserted as a user. So now for that reason, what we could do is and add our SQL code for inserting data in the database. Now here's the thing. If we go to post, that is, we go to localhost / post, then nothing really shows up here. We are in fact querying users. So if you head over to terminal, you will see that rows are in fact empty, which is the console log here. And we are using Vercel Postgres npm package for that. And we are using SQL, which executes the SQL statement here. So now similarly, we could do the same thing with inserting data into the database. So for that, let's just copy this, add it here. Similarly, copy this whole thing and add it as an import as well, so that this command works. So now if we log it, and say rows, then we should see something. But we don't want select, we want in fact insert. So what we could do is select, let's say insert name comma image URL, because remember image URL is also being set up, and then we want to insert into users table, and then let's just add brackets. That's just how it is. And then we need to add values, and then for that we need to say name and comma, we want image URL as well. So now for image URL, I already have this specific image URL. So, which if we open up, it's this image right here. And you could change this into getting it from the user, but for now, let's just keep it hard coded. Now, we do get this error argument of type form data entry value or null is not assignable. Again, this is just TypeScript telling us that this value is not assignable, and we will address that. So let's say I enter the name Kobe and hit submit. And now if we see the rows, the name is Kobe, but the rows is still empty. If we go to the database and now if we query it, we will see that Kobe name did get inserted, which is awesome. We didn't need to create an API call separately. We just inserted this specific code directly in here, which is amazing. But now you can see that how this specific function is getting really long, and we also need to address this specific form validation error as well, a TypeScript error as well, because we have Kobe here, but this could also be null, so we need to address that. But first, let's go ahead and move this entire function into a new file. So for that, let's just create a new folder called as actions, and all our server actions can move in here. So instead of calling this action, let's just call this lib. Let's just call this file as actions instead. So now this file is going to execute on the server. So let's just call use server there. And now what we could do is we could move this function completely over there. Now let's just export this function, and then we can call this function from lib/actions. So now that we have this specific function over here, we can start adding more code further, and now you can see how our page is looking a lot cleaner. Now we also need to move this SQL command here so that our query executes as intended. If you're also enjoying this tutorial so far, then I also write a weekly newsletter called Frontend Snacks that you should check out as well. The link is in the description below. So now let's go ahead and resolve this specific error that we get and make TypeScript happy and also our data validation happy. So for example, we have argument of type form data entry value or null is not assignable to parameter of type primitive. Now, when you're dealing with forms in general, you will experience a lot of different validation errors, especially runtime validation, because you don't know what the user is going to necessarily enter in their form, and we need some sort of a way to handle it all together. So for that, we are going to use a really cool library called as Zod. Now, Zod is essentially a TypeScript first schema validation library with static type inference. But more importantly, it is a schema validation library which allows you to validate parse form data at runtime as well. So what that means is this specific error that we get, we can easily handle that with Zod. Now make sure you install Zod from npm, but I have already gone ahead and installed it, and you can just import Zod by importing Z from Zod. Now, what we need to do is we need to tell Zod that, hey, this is how our form looks like. We have a name, we have an image URL, and again, keep this in mind that image URL would probably be replaced with some sort of a form input element in the future. But for now, let's keep name and image URL together. So we need to tell Zord that, hey, we have the specific schema with a name and with a image URL or whatever else that you have in your form. And then we are going to validate those form fields to make sure that if it's empty, or if you want to perform some sort of validation, that is, the name character should be minimum 1 character. It should not be less than 3 characters, or whatever it might be, whatever validation you want. Zod has a bunch of different functions that we can use for that. So for example, if we want a minimum, then it also has a min, max, length of an array, and so on. There are a bunch of different functions like that if you want to make sure that your form element is not empty, then there is also a function for that, which is pretty awesome. So there's a lot more we can do with Zod. Again, you can see here it has shape, it has partial, it has a lot of different functions that we could use with form validation. So let's just create our schema first. So one, we are going to create schema, then we are going to validate the fields, and then we are going to invoke SQL query. Let's go ahead and create our Zod schema. So what we could do is you could just say form schema is z.object, and then here we can describe that we have a name. The name would be a string. And then we have an image URL, which is also a string. So again, we are saying z.string. Now, we want the name to be minimum 1 character, so we could do that as well. This is our form schema that we have defined. Now what we need to do is we need to validate it against the form data that we get. So what we could do here is we could just say validated fields, and here we can say form schema dot safe parse. And again, if you look at safe parse function, what it does is if you don't want Zod to throw errors when the validation fails, use safe parse. What this method does is it returns an object containing the successfully parsed data or a Zod error. So if there is an error, you would get a object like this. But if it passes, then you get an object like this, which is amazing. So what we could do is something similar to this, where we safe parse it, then if it's not successful, then handle the error, else do something with the data. So what we could do here is we're saying safe parse, and then at this point, we want to make sure that we're getting the form data and parsing it. So here we can move our name and image URL. So now this is an object, so we need colon here. We can get rid of this completely. And again, image URL could just be a string that we have defined here, keeping in mind that this is going to get replaced in the future. So as simple as that, we are creating the schema, we are validating it against our form fields, and now here is a time for us to check if it's not successful. So what we could say is if validated fields.success is not true, then let's go ahead and handle the schema in a specific way. Then what we could say is we could log the error. We could say error occurred, and here we can just print the validated fields and also return something for our user. So if you want to show something to our user, then we can as well. So here we can just say type is error. Again, just to make sure, we can then check for type on the front end and then get the errors from Zod. So in order for us to do that, we could do validated fields dot error, just like they say here, but let's just flatten it. So they have a function called flatten, and let's just get all the field errors that we get on our form. Similarly, add a message as well that missed fields failed to create user. All right, so now that we have this, we can remove this constant. And what we need to do is instead of calling name directly, now let's just call name from Zod because it has validated the field, so it has given us some sort of information here. So what we could do is, again, we get data back. So we can say, give me name, give me image URL from validated fields dot data. And now look at that. The error that we were seeing, the TypeScript error is completely gone because we are handling it on top and Zod is helping us do that. We could insert our data right here. And again, let's just see, instead of saying rows, let's just see data. And again, data, and see what happens now. Because we already have hooked up our create user action. And if we go back here and change this to whatever, and then we can query the Postgres database to see how it functions. So now we can just say Luna, hit submit, go to the terminal. You can see that we did get a data object back with command insert. Then if we go to Postgres database and query user, there you go. We do see Luna here as well. At the same time, we have made TypeScript happy, which is pretty amazing. Now, we have handled form validation errors with Zod, but there could be errors with our database. And for that, let's just wrap this code inside a try catch block. So we are moving this entire code inside a try catch error. And then here we are following the same convention where let's just log the error. Maybe let's just say database error occurred. And here let's just return again, same thing, type is error. And then let's just give it a message to show to the user. Again, this is just for our learning purposes. So we could just say failed to create user. Now, this message could be changed into something more user friendly. If there's something that the user can do, this is something just for us. But for now, let's just enter this as a message. So now that we have this, we could go back to the page. And then again, let's try to do the same thing. Just enter a name, Sydney Bean. Hit submit. Go back to PostGres database. Again, let's query the users. Sydney Bean is right here, which is awesome. But we have done a lot more here, right? We want to make sure that there's an error that occurs as well. So what if we were to throw an error here? Again, just to make sure that the catch block works, error. And now if I go back here and enter submit, and look at that, we do get an error here at database error occurred error, which is what we want. Now, in our specific server actions, we are returning a bunch of errors. And some of those errors, for example, a validation error, we want to show that to the user. So for example, if the user did not enter X characters in a specific input and we want them to, then we need to show the user that, hey, you need to enter something here. And we expect this type of an input. But right now we are not. We are just storing all of that in server action. But if you go inside page, server action is necessarily returning a bunch of errors. But in our form here, there's no way for us to handle it. There's no return type to action, or there's no other way inside form to do it specifically. And for that, React gives us a hook called as React Form State. Now, in React Form State, it allows you to update the state based on a result of a form action. So it gives us a state and a form action, and then we can call server action here, and then manipulate data and show the errors to the user as well. So we could do that. And Next.js, if we do the same, similarly, we can say state form action, useFormState. Again, useFormState comes from React DOM, and then we can call form action here and then print any of the messages that we want on the form. So let's do that now. All right, so now let's copy this and then add the code here, use form state, and instead of create to do, it should be create user action. And this initial state could be whatever state we want. So in our case, the initial state could be that we have a message of null, and we also have a bunch of errors as well. And instead of form action, let's just call this dispatch to make it more accurate. And now instead of saying action equals create user action, let's just call this dispatch. Or we could call this whatever we want. What we could do is log it for our users. We could just log the state. And now if I hit submit, this value will get inserted into the database, for example. But let's say there is no other value, which would lead to input errors. You can see that we have a 500 internal server error. And if we go to our terminal, it says that you cannot import a component that needs useFormState. It only works in a client component. So we need to make this component a client component. So we could do that here. Now that we have done this, let's try it again. Hit submit. And here it says error occurred, success is false, and error is a getter function. So you can see that now we are starting to see those errors in the code. So now we can start showing those errors to our users. Under our form, we could just say if state.type equals error, then to render something. So we could just say just a class name and state.message. That's the message that we want to show to the user. And let's just make this pretty by giving this specific class name that I have already prepared. So this will make it look like it's an error to our user. Similarly, if we want validation messages as well, then we could do something similar here under the input. So we could just say state.errors, dot name and print it. Again, we can just say a span, and we could say state dot errors dot name dot join, and there you go. So now again, let's just give it a class name, and here we can just say text red 600, and then text is going to be small. So now here what we are saying is give me the name errors, and every error that shows up in the form will get appended to its name object. So let's say if the form field was image URL, then it would be errors.image URL. So we are just prepending the errors, we're joining it all, and this adds all the elements of an array into a string. So that's what we are doing here. Now let's just test it out. So now if we hit submit, you will see that formData.get is not a function. And that's because now that we are passing create user action to use form state, the input parameters have changed a little bit. So here we can just say it's actually previous state, but we don't need to use any of that, for example. So we could just pass this as any for now. So now if you refresh the page and again hit submit, now you can see that the validation errors have appeared. You can see that there are missing fields, failed to create user, and at the same time, it's saying string must contain at least one character. Now if I say Kobe Beanie and hit submit, we should see Kobe Beanie appearing in our table. So if I do that, if I query it again, you can see Kobe Beanie is in fact being inserted into the database, which is amazing. Now, one of the biggest advantages of server actions is that you can perform routing operations within server functions. So, what we could do is that once a user's information has been successfully inserted, right now what happens is if I say Kobe Beanie 3 and hit submit, even though data does get inserted, we see it in the database, we still stay in the same form, which is not what we want. We want to redirect the user to a slash post page. But if we go to slash post page, even though we are selecting everything from the user, it doesn't show up. Now, these are two different problems. First, let's solve the redirecting problem. So, what we could do is that Next.js gives us a specific function to redirect the user from one page to the other, and all within a server action. So, for example, we could use the redirect function from next navigation and add any absolute or relative URL, which is what we want. So what we could do is import it, paste it here. Similarly, redirect the user as well. So at the all the way at the bottom, let's go ahead and redirect the user. And here we can say slash post. Now if we go back here and just say Sydney Beanie and hit submit, there you go. We have been redirected to slash post, which is exactly what this function is supposed to do. Well, that's pretty awesome that if it's server actions, you don't need to then implement a new router altogether, do all that fancy stuff, and it spend a lot of time doing it. You could just use redirect right away. That makes our life really easy. So now next, you will notice that again, we talked about this. Slash post doesn't have any information. But if you look at this, it does query users. So now if you go to Postgres database and query the users, we see all the users that we have entered. Then why does Post has not submitted? And the answer to that is caching. So if we go to revalidate and cache data, whenever a form is submitted, the server action can update the cache data and revalidate any cache keys that should change. Whenever we are using forms or using server action, there is a lot of cache data already. So our data is cached. We need to tell Next.js that, hey, refresh your cache so that we can go ahead and invalidate a cache. There is fresh data here. We don't need to keep the old data around. So for that, we could use another function called as revalidatePath, which will allow you to invalidate the Next.js cache on demand. So now here, again, in the actions, go back here and let's just import revalidatePath. In fact, revalidatePath comes from next cache. So let's just do that from next cache, and all the way at the bottom, let's just revalidate and then redirect. So now I'm just going to say post because that's the route we want to revalidate it. we want to say that, hey, there is new data here, refetch again. If we try it out again, go back here, and let's just say Luna Beanie and hit submit. Look at that. We have now finally received new data, as well as that our cache has been revalidated. That means we have fresh data altogether. And that's the advantage of revalidate path. And with Next.js, one of the advantages is that you don't have to refetch new data all the time. It is going to do a lot of caching operations for performance and optimization reasons, but giving a function like this in server action allow us to purge that cache and refetch data and get us really fresh data. Now it's time to implement loading states. Whenever we submit a form, we want to change the submit button to say loading, and then submit the data as the request is in progress, so that we are showing something to the user if you are on a slow data network and so on. So for that, what we can do is we need some sort of a state where we say if it's loading, right? Then we want to say loading, or else we want to say submit. But this specific loading state is something that we need to retrieve. So just like we have useFormStatus as a hook that's available for us, there's another hook that's available called as useFormStatus to display the loading state to us. It shows a loading state when a form is submitting on the server. It automatically implements the loading functionality for us, which is amazing. So for example, what we could do is we could just say const pending, again, invoke the hook here, and let's just call this aria disabled is pending to our button, and use pending itself for our state. So we're saying if it's pending, then it's loading, otherwise it's submit. So use form status is not defined. We can just import use form status from React DOM. Now, if we go ahead and say Kobe Beanie 4 and hit submit, we didn't see anything much. It was really instant, it was really quick. So now, if we change the network and let's just enable some slow 3G, that means we're throttling. So here, I'm just thinking of all the dogs that I know. Let's just say Danny and hit submit. Nothing really happens. In fact, even though it took a second, nothing really happens. And that's because in order for us to show use form status, it needs to be in a separate client component altogether. Like it said, the form status hook can only be used as a child of the form element using a server action. And for that reason, we need to create a new component altogether. So we could just copy this whole thing and then paste it here. Again, we don't need any of that. And let's just move the button that we have created and call submit button here. And then on top, let's just call this. Now, let's give it a shot again. Now, if we go back and let's just go back to no throttling for now so that the page loads. And again, going back to slow 3G, here we can say Danny boy and hit submit. You can see loading state, and it's too slow because it's on slow 3G. But the minute it's done, and there you go. All the images are fully displayed because it has loaded. So I really hope you enjoyed this comprehensive tutorial on server actions, where we cover all types of scenarios for how you can handle loading, error, form validation, and so much more inside this specific comprehensive tutorial. Now, if you really liked it, please let me know and hit the like button on this video, because this tells the algorithm that you really want to see these type of videos, and it also gives me a good signal that, hey, you really like it and you want me to create content like this. And if you have any questions, please comment below and let me know as well. Thank you so much. Bye for now.